What's up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of Critical Consciousness. Guys, you already know what we're talking about today. We're talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Karl Marx himself, and his theory of historical materialism. And more broadly, we're going to be kind of answering this question: what is communism? And communism is admittedly a very controversial topic, right? Few words or concepts can ignite hostility or indignation quite like communism. Even in the shifting US political landscape where socialism is increasingly more palatable, the overwhelming majority of people, both progressive and conservative alike, still draw the line at communism. It's sort of considered this other realm that deviates too far into the extreme, too far to the left on the political spectrum. It's not even so much that communism as an idea, right? Equality, sharing is inherently bad. In fact, you often hear people, deeply anti-communist people even, say things like, communism sounds really good on paper, but in practice, etc., etc. And these types of notions permeate so many aspects of the US American political consciousness. And as someone who grew up in the United States, they've also permeated my consciousness. I have unquestioningly accepted these notions almost by default from the time I was a child. Without ever having studied or done my own research, I had somehow internalized the impression that communism is inherently bad, something that doesn't work, right? And I know this to be the experience of many others who were brought up in the West as well. If you go around and ask the average person, what do you think about communism? The responses you're going to get are overwhelmingly negative. And with this sort of mass conviction, you would almost think that most US Americans are learned social scientists or something. But are these notions accurate? Are they based on research and investigation? Or are they based on a misunderstanding, a complete lack of understanding, moreover? Now, I'm someone who has had the luxury, the privilege even, of going down these sorts of rabbit holes, of studying social theory, of investigating. And what I intend to do with this video is basically share what I've learned, share some insights, explain what is communism actually. Where does it come from? Is our fear of it necessary or well-grounded? So this is what we'll be discussing on today's episode of Critical Consciousness. So what is communism? The philosopher credited with its invention is, of course, Karl Marx, and it's important to say right off the bat that Karl Marx didn't actually invent the idea of communism. It's just the word he used to describe an observation that he was making. You see, part of what separated Marx from many other scholars of the day was his holistic approach to social science, to studying society. Marx studied anthropology, diverse human cultures across the planet. He studied politics, he studied economics, he studied history. And he used these disciplines to holistically develop theories about human society in general. And part of the framework that he developed was grounded in what's called the stages of civilization, which fits into the larger framework of historical materialism. That is to say, upon studying the history of human civilization, he noticed a few key laws, if you will. The first of which is the fact that human society changes over time and that these changes have distinct characteristics. And altogether, considering the economic and social relations, how human beings organize themselves during given periods of history, he noticed that up to the period in which he was living, that there had been 4 distinct stages of human civilization. 4 main ways that humans had organized themselves up to that point. And these 4 stages are primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism. And I'm going to go over each of these in quite a bit of detail. But before we discuss the first stage of primitive communism, I want to go over a very important point of context. which is the whole of human history, right? How long have we, Homo sapiens, human beings, been around? And the archaeological consensus on this is that modern human beings, right, us, we, have been around for approximately 300,000 years. And the reason this is such an important piece of context is because it will help us really conceptualize the scale in which these different stages of civilization are taking place. So the first stage of civilization, beginning 300,000 years ago at the dawn of humanity, according to Marx, and really according to the scientific consensus, is something that he called primitive communism. And leaving aside this kind of fancy term, we already know what this kind of means or what this looked like. When human beings were living as hunter-gatherers, nomadic peoples, traveling in tribes or bands by foot, hunting animals, scavenging shrubs, berries, and beans. A lot of people might have kind of the caveman image come to mind, although that's technically not accurate. But this stage, this first stage of human history, is what's known as primitive communism. And it's really important to break down what these words mean in a scientific context. Primitive as in prime, as in the first or the original, and communism, which is an anthropological term that refers to a form of human society in which there is no state, no class, and no money. So the purpose of this video to unpack what is communism. Of course, it's really important to start with the definition, right? What communism literally means is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, which is to say a society where there is no government, no exchange of money, and where there is no class, no one who is more important or powerful than anyone else because of the amount of money that they have. And ironically, when many people hear that, regardless of what side of the political spectrum they're on, it's like, a society with no government, no money, and no class? Sounds pretty cool, right? And believe it or not, this is exactly how human beings, how we organized ourselves for most of our time on this planet. From the period of about 300,000 years ago up until 6,000 years ago, this is how we lived. In other words, for 294,000 of our 300,000 year existence, human beings, we lived as communists, as primitive communists, as hunter-gatherers. And I think this makes sense when you simply look at a depiction of this period of time. Like, yeah, there is no government, there is no money, and people are equal, right? And I also think it makes sense then why this period of history is romanticized by so many of us. Of course, we didn't have medicines, infant mortality was extremely high, the average lifespan was like 30 years old, so it's not to say it should be romanticized, but I think it makes sense why a lot of people can kind of daydream about living in a tribe or something like that. So that brings us to the next stage of Marx's stages of civilization, which is slave society. And we see the rise of slave society at the dawn of the agricultural revolution during the 3rd and 4th millennia BCE, which was about 6,000 years ago. And this period marked the beginning of modern civilization as we know it. Essentially, human beings stopped being nomadic, we stopped traveling by foot, hunting and searching for food, and we become stationary because we sort of figure out, well, rather than constantly being on the move looking for food, we can just plant a bunch of crops and wait for them to yield. We can basically post up here and wait for the harvest. And so we begin to create cities and towns around these crops and plantations. So this is the first time in human history we begin to see a surplus, right? For the first time, we begin to see more food than we can even eat. And this sounds like a good thing, right? It's like surplus, abundance, right? That's a good thing. And it was, in a sense. However, this is also when we begin to see the development of class or the rise of inequality. Some people taking control over the surplus and deciding who gets to have some and who doesn't. And this kind of dynamic of, if you want to eat, then you need to work for me because I control this. And so we get slave society, a society in which the overwhelming majority of human beings are enslaved to the small few who control the surplus. Almost like a Mad Max scenario, if you will. And we're also already familiar with what this looked like. Think ancient Egypt or the Roman Empire. These were some of the famous civilizations that existed during the stage of civilization that Marx refers to as slave society. And before we dive into the next stage of civilization, I do want to note that the manner by which human beings have transitioned from stage to stage is equally important, if not more important, to Marx's concept of historical materialism as understanding the distinct stages themselves. In other words, it's not only important to look at each of the stages and what characterizes them, but it's even more critical to look at how we get from stage to stage. How or why do we transition out of slave society into feudalism? Or how or why do we transition out of feudalism into capitalism? And I'm going to discuss this a little later on in this video once I finish explaining the characteristics of each stage. But to continue, the next stage of civilization, according to Marx, is feudalism. And feudalism arises around 500 CE, which is about 1500 years ago, after the fall of the Roman Empire. And feudalism is most commonly represented by the medieval era, or medieval times, right? You have kings and queens and knights and castles. Think Game of Thrones, for example. This is the period of history most commonly associated with feudalism. And the most distinguishing feature of feudalism was the relation between the nobility, or the lords, and the peasants, and or the serfs. All of the land of a particular kingdom was controlled by the nobility, kings and queens, and the peasants were conditionally permitted to use the land to cultivate it or make some other use of it. The peasants would pay the lords rent or tax, usually by way of their labor or food render. And in return, the peasant would get to use the land to live, potentially raise a family, and receive military protection. And what differentiated feudalism from slave society was the fact that the peasants were technically free. They were not considered property of the noble class, and so the noble class couldn't buy and sell peasants and or serfs at will. And albeit few, peasants and or serfs had some rights, whereas slaves in slave society had no rights. So in feudalism, there was more opportunity for the everyday person to live a dignified life. And I use heavy air quotes there for dignified. Now, of course, serfs, peasants were never permitted to own their own land. That was never in the cards, right? So they would spend a whole lifetime paying rent or leasing the land from the nobility. They had no real decision-making power or agency over their own lives, as all of the decisions for the society were made by the kings and queens. And that brings us to the next stage, which is the stage that we're currently at in 2026, which is, of course, capitalism. And capitalism emerges or begins in the 16th and 17th centuries, which is about 500 years ago from where we are today. And this is a really, really important point to emphasize, especially because I think a lot of people just sort of assume that capitalism is this really old system that's like tried and tested and it's the best system, right? Capitalism is only about 500 years old. And remember, when positioned in the scale of human history, which is about 300,000 years old, 500 years is nothing. To put it in other words, human beings have lived in capitalism for about 0.17% of our total history. And as we move through the stages, you might notice that each stage seems to be improving upon its predecessor, right? Feudalism was a little bit better for the average person than slave society, and likewise, capitalism is a little bit better for the average person than feudalism, although there's still quite a bit of nuance there. Of course, as we know with capitalism, it's possible for the average person to acquire property. This is one of the defining characteristics of capitalism, private property. And so, unlike slave society and feudalism, in capitalism, there is some opportunity for upward mobility, right? It is technically possible for someone born in poverty to eventually become a property owner. Furthermore, in capitalism, there are no lords, right? There are no kings and queens who reign over all and who single-handedly decide the future of humanity. Although there is still quite a bit of overlap with feudalism in this sense when you consider the decision-making power that a modern-day billionaire has, for example. And when discussing the defining characteristics of capitalism, it's really important to discuss what capitalism is not, because there's a lot of prevailing conventional mythology surrounding it. Many people think, for example, that capitalism is when, people trade things on an open market. So when people have businesses or provide services and they sell their products and services on an open market in exchange for money, an economy essentially. But this is not what capitalism is, okay? And one really easy way to remember this is the fact that human beings have been engaging in trade and commerce since we were hunter-gatherers hundreds of thousands of years ago. Human economy is not unique to capitalism. Neither is money nor credit even. In fact, we have evidence of the usage of credit dating back to the period of slave society thousands of years ago. And this is an essential myth to dispel because it's part of what makes everyday people believe that capitalism is designed for everyone's benefit or for their benefit. These class-based systems, right, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, it's really important to remember that these are systems of order and control more than they are economic systems. When we're talking about private property, it might be cool, like, oh, well, that's cool, I can own property. But we're also talking about some people owning and controlling the most valuable resources that we all need to survive. Things like land, oil, gas, other sources of energy, precious metals, minerals, and increasingly things like water even. These resources are owned by some individuals. And what do we have to do if we want or when we need some of these resources? Well, we have to pay the people who own them, right? Almost like we're paying rents. And in this sense, we see the significant overlap or the really stark similarities between slave society, feudalism, and capitalism. In capitalism, very wealthy landowners control the resources and land that we need to survive, and we have to work for them to be able to pay them to get access to the resources, which is awfully similar to peasants having to work or pay rents to the kings and queens during the medieval era, right, of feudalism. It's really not all that different, right? And without this historical context, it's really easy to just sort of be living in this modern world and to assume that capitalism is the end-all be-all, right, or the best system. But when we add this context, when we learn about the origins of capitalism, the origins of class-based societies, we start to get the sense that maybe this isn't the end-all be-all. If there's one thing that history shows us, it's that things change, right? Human and societies change. Social and economic relations change over time. And this is exactly what Marx sort of posited, right? Capitalism is not the end of history. It's simply another stage, another rung in the ladder of human civilization. Primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and then what? Much the same way that none of us would envy those living in feudalism and wish to return to it, the humans of the future will likely one day discuss the barbarism of capitalism and count their blessings for not having to experience it. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what the future holds, right? We can only theorize about it, about what might come next. We can only really make educated guesses, and this is exactly what Marx did when he was writing about a post-capitalist future. You see, along the course of his study, he noticed that each stage of civilization carries its own set of contradictions, its own set of irreconcilable forces, forces that create tension in the society, and forces which eventually erupt to produce a new society. And the fundamental force that Marx attributed these eruptions to is something he called class struggle, which simply put means the struggle between the classes, the struggle between rich and poor, between the haves and the have-nots, between the slave masters and the slaves. What Marx noticed is that each of these phases of transition in class society, the transition from slave society to feudalism and then from feudalism to capitalism, were marked by intense and violent periods of class struggle initiated by the exploited or lower classes. Basically, when the lower classes, whether the slaves or the peasants, decided enough was enough, that their exploitation had been taken too far, and they rose up against the upper classes violently. And I'm going to discuss some historical events that took place during these transitionary periods to illustrate what Marx is talking about here. So when we're looking at the transition from slave society to feudalism, there were a lot of really obvious contradictions and points of contention in the society. Chief among them was, of course, the fact that most people were slaves, and human beings don't like to be slaves, right? Human beings want to be free. They want to have their freedom. So this, Marx would describe as an irreconcilable aspect of slave society, something that was never sustainable, right? For the majority of human beings to accept being slaves while their masters told them what to do, told them when they could eat, forced them to go to war, right? These social relations were bound to reach a head at some point. And it did. And we see this most notably with the Spartacus slave revolts, and specifically the Third Servile War, which took place between 73 and 71 BCE, which is about 2,000 years ago. And the Third Servile War was the last in a series of slave rebellions against the Roman Republic. And I'm going to borrow this little piece from Wikipedia. The revolt began in 73 BCE with the escape of around 70 slave gladiators from a gladiator school in Capua. They easily defeated the small Roman force sent to recapture them, and within 2 years they had been joined by some 120,000 men, women, and children. The able-bodied adults of this large group were a surprisingly effective armed force that repeatedly showed they could withstand or defeat the Roman military. Okay, and I want to be clear here. It's not like, there was slave society, and then the Third Servile War happened, and then boom, humans transitioned into feudalism. These transitionary phases don't happen overnight, and they certainly don't happen because of one event. They're processes that can take several hundred years. But events such as the Third Servile War are noteworthy because they kind of landmark these significant changes in human civilization. Up to that point, slave society and the social relations therein were working relatively well, at least for the emperors and the slave masters or the upper classes. But now, not only were the slaves beginning to question their conditions and be like, wait a minute, why are we accepting this? But they developed the courage to do something about it, right? To change their conditions. And this involved, of course, putting their lives on the line. And this struggle forced the upper classes to reconsider these social relations, not out of benevolence, but out of their own self-preservation. They didn't want to live with the constant anxiety of a potential slave rebellion, let alone be on the receiving end of one. And so these stark contradictions, these irreconcilable forces of slave society, this class struggle begins to transform the social relations over time until eventually humanity transitions into a different mode of production, into feudalism. And as discussed before, feudalism is a little bit better, a little bit more fair, if you will. Peasants and or serfs, the new lower classes of feudalism, which is to say the overwhelming majority of people in society, could no longer be bought and sold at the whims of their masters. They had some rights, and many people could also have a little piece of land, which granted they couldn't own, but they could raise a family on it. They weren't always forced to sacrifice their lives in some war. And so in some ways, we could say that feudalism is an attempt to reconcile some of the previously irreconcilable forces that were present in slave society, an attempt to mend some of the inherent class contradictions. But, of course, feudalism is still replete with contradictions and irreconcilable class antagonisms. As we said earlier, you have kings and queens reigning over all, living lavish lifestyles, while peasants are living in poverty. They couldn't own their own land. They had to pay their lords rents and or taxes for eternity, and they could oftentimes be kicked off of the land that they were using at the whim of their lords. So even though the living conditions of the average person improved in feudalism, most people were still largely not free, and many people's conditions resembled those of slave society a bit too closely. So similar to what happened during the Spartacus slave revolts in slave society, we likewise see violent uprisings initiated by the lower classes against the monarchs of the day. Some such famous events include the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the German Peasants' War of 1525, and really one of the nails in the coffin of feudalism in Europe was the execution of King Louis XVI, who was famously guillotined at the Place de la Révolution in Paris in 1793. This particular event marked the end of 1,000 years of French monarchy, of feudalism. And these sorts of violent clashes between the classes are what catalyze humanity's transition into capitalism, a new mode of production which, much the same way feudalism represented a slightly more fair set of social and economic relations than slave society, capitalism represents a slightly more fair set of social and economic relations than feudalism. And before we dive into the next part of Marxist theory, I want to really drive home the most critical element of historical materialism, which is once again class struggle. Part of what differentiated Marx from earlier scholars was his emphasis on class struggle as the most pivotal force in history and its transformation. So these violent uprisings of the lower classes throughout history are not some peripheral or small aspect of historical materialism. They're the focal point. Whereas many scholars prior to Marx believed that human society changes due to the creation of new ideas or maybe the creation of new technologies, Marx argued that human society changes due to ruptures created by class contradictions, created by the irreconcilable forces of class society, some people having so much while others have so little. And when this dynamic inevitably reaches a boiling point, when the injustice becomes too great, there's a clash. That's the primary driver of change in human history, according to Marx. Not new ideas, which would be idealism, not technologies or inventions, but class struggle and class war, which is materialism, people's material conditions. Which brings us back to the original focus of the video and a new part of Marxist theory, which is really just a continuation of these stages of civilization and historical materialism. But here we are today living in capitalism. And indeed, capitalism represents a slightly more fair set of relations than did feudalism. But as many people know, capitalism is still replete with contradictions and class antagonisms. One obvious contradiction in this regard is the fact that 8 people control half of the world's wealth. We've even seen the rise of the world's first trillionaire while roughly half of the population in the United States struggles to pay for housing. And of course, the decision-making power of the ultra-wealthy today resembles that of the kings and queens of the medieval era. The pressures of constant growth ushered in by capitalism have led to a level of resource extraction that threatens life as we know it on this planet. We've seen new depths of human depravity exhibited by phenomena like the Epstein files. The list of contradictions in capitalism really goes on for quite a while. But one of the main contradictions of capitalism that Marx focused on revolves around this concept of wage labor, which differentiates capitalism from its 2 class-based predecessors in slave society and feudalism. In slave society, slaves obviously weren't paid for their work at all. In feudalism, peasants also weren't paid for their work, though they were compensated by way of conditional land allotment. In capitalism, people are paid for their work or their labor. They sell their labor for a wage, hence the term wage labor. And Marx noticed an inherent contradiction in this dynamic, which is the fact that employers, right, people who issue the wages, are always going to try to pay their employees or the workers or laborers as little as they can get away with to maximize their own share of the profits. As employers, and especially modern day corporations who are trying to maximize profits, they're incentivized to squeeze as much as they can out of their laborers for as little as they can get away with. And this creates an inherent tension, an inherent conflict between the employer and employee. And this contradiction, this conflict, Marx noted, is inherently unsustainable. The same way that the inherent contradictions of slave society or feudalism eventually reached a tipping point, The contradictions of capitalism will also inevitably reach a tipping point. The exploited classes will not only begin to understand their conditions, but they will also eventually decide to rise up and change them. And so, what comes after capitalism? Well, based on the contradictions of capitalism, Marx posits that socialism will be the next stage of civilization. The same way that feudalism addressed some of the contradictions of slave society, the same way that capitalism addressed some of the contradictions of feudalism, a system of socialism will address some of the contradictions of capitalism. And there is a lot of misunderstanding in the West about what constitutes socialism, especially in the United States. See, many people believe that socialism is when the government does stuff, right? When the government taxes people, especially wealthy people, and uses the tax revenue to create social programs or provide safety nets to prevent people from kind of falling in the cracks. But this is actually not what socialism is, according to Marx. That would be more like Keynesian economics or welfare state economics. But you see, welfare economics doesn't address any of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, such as wage labor or private property. So socialism, according to Marx, is characterized by collective ownership of the means of production. So instead of the most valuable natural resources, the most important factories, etc., being owned and controlled privately for profit, these resources would be controlled collectively or nationalized, and their distribution would be driven by people's needs rather than by profit. Together with this, another defining feature of socialism is democracy in the workplace. So instead of private owners or CEOs making all of the decisions for a company, telling the workers what to do, what to produce, how to produce it, how the profits will be invested, the workers would decide these matters by way of direct participatory democracy. These would be some of the features of socialism, according to Marx, because they would address some of the contradictions present in capitalism. And to kind of tie this all together, Marx posited that socialism would eventually pave the way or create the conditions for communism, which is sort of the final stage of human civilization, right? Primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and eventually communism. Communism, again, meaning a classless, stateless, moneyless society, but this time, rather than a primitive communism, it would be an advanced communism where humans enjoy surplus, machines and computers do a lot of the hardest labor, and humans are free to pursue their authentic interests and share their understandings and knowledge for the betterment of the society instead of for profit. And this starts to sound really utopian and ridiculous until you remember that this is where it all began. For 98% of our existence on this planet, we lived in a communist mode of production. And to kind of add to this a little bit, there's almost this evolutionary element to Marxist theory of historical materialism. It's almost like human beings are biologically hardwired to be communists. Why else would we have organized ourselves in such a way for such a long time? Accordingly, human beings have this yearning to live the way we were biologically designed to live. That's why all forms of class society have these inherent contradictions, because these modes of production are at a direct odds with our innate desire to be free, to be part of a community, and to have a sense of purpose. This is what communism means. And socialism, by addressing the inherent contradictions of class-based society, acts as kind of the bridge between capitalism and communism. Which is why it doesn't make sense, for example, when people say things like, I'm a socialist but not a communist, right? It's kind of like saying you don't want the socialism part to work. Another example of a common misconception is when people say things like, I think we need a mix of both capitalism and socialism, right? You can't have two different modes of production. You can't have democracy in the workplace and not have democracy in the workplace, right? That doesn't really make any sense. And I think these misconceptions, again, stem from the conventional understanding of socialism as being when the government does stuff, right? Or what in reality is Keynesian or welfare state economics. Socialism is a new mode of production that paves the way for essentially our return to communism. And if you're like me, once you kind of study and understand some of these theories, what these words actually mean, they start to sound a whole lot less belligerent and absurd than what they've been made out to be. And it's really no coincidence, right? People who have a vested interest in the current mode of production are obviously going to try to uphold the current mode of production, whether by slandering or outright hiding any bit of insight that challenges it. There were plenty members of the upper classes who benefited from slave society or feudalism, right? But none of us are eager to return to those types of systems. And likewise, there are a lot of capitalists and people who benefit from capitalism who want to hold on to capitalism. But long term, there is no holding on to any of these class-based systems because their contradictions make them unsustainable. While there is certainly delaying, there's no stopping the forces of history. Change is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And when the contradictions of capitalism become too great, we will also reach a tipping point as a society. Our innate yearning for a more just mode of production will shine through. And if history is anything to go by, it likely won't come without a fight. Thank you very much for tuning into Critical Consciousness today, y'all. The most important thing to me is that these episodes are helpful in kind of aiding our critical thinking, and in this case, aiding our understanding of what actually constitutes communism. What is communism? Of course, it's impossible to touch every moment of history and to answer every question, so if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to comment because who knows, maybe your question could inspire the topic of a future video. And as always, if you like this episode, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. It really does a lot in terms of helping build the momentum of the channel and allowing as many people as possible to get this information. And as always, take it easy.